Okay. Now, do you have any question about Booker Washington? I think last time I sort of summarized the main ideas for you there. If you still think you want to ask about it in any way, please do, because I think it was very clear. Of course, he was highlighting mainly, as I said, highlighting the question of racism and racial really problems and the ways in which he was brought up, and brought up in slavery or as a slave, and later how he got freed and freedom and all that. So the whole question of of racism and racial, if you like, politics is very obvious there. And I think that's the main idea. Of course, our aim here in this course is autobiography. And as I said, this was really a great example of autobiography, both as a text and as a narrative. And I told you it's very close to personal, absolutely personal, subjective narrative, close to fiction, but it's not fiction. And this is very, very important to understand. It is not fiction. Autobiography is not fiction, it's reality. But as I said, there were a lot of maybe talk, and people discussed and said and believed that maybe he was a bit personal, and maybe giving his own sort of, maybe his own prejudiced opinion, being a black man, maybe. But really he was reflecting on his own reality, and that's really the whole thing. Now, this one example here, the one we have today, is again, as I said, Edward Said, really as an Arab Palestinian, originally Palestinian American, who was brought up in Palestine, born in Jerusalem, educated in early schooling, right at the heart of the British Mandate of Palestine, because he was born in around 1930s, and he was forced to leave, or to really to be sort of pushed away from Jerusalem with his family to Alexandria in Egypt, where he received his schooling, his early schools in Alexandria as a Christian Palestinian. He went there, where he, believe it or not, one of his classmates in the class at that time was Omar Sharif, as the great actor, the Egyptian actor, was his own classmate in school. In fact, in this autobiography, he talked about it a lot in his autobiography. Of course, Omar Sharif, as you know, his name was not Omar Sharif, of course. His name originally was something like Shalhoub, I think. His surname, his family name, Shalhoub. Anyway, so this autobiography is great, really, to me, is a great text of literature, and really of criticism, because when you look at the title, Out of Place, really it's to do with his own real history and real background. Now, as you can see, really, Edward Said is just saying, that he was always made to feel that he was really out of place. Here I show you in my notes, and I will share with you this. Yeah, I will share that with you here. Yeah, you can see it. Of course, as I told you, as you can see here, the book the title is really, as I said, social and politically orientated. Of course, as I would say, maybe Edward Said was a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University. In fact, myself, when I was in New York, myself in 1995, in fact, I visited him in real sense. I went to his office at Columbia University in New York. And he was such a massive, really important figure in comparative literature. And his huge influence was mainly on many Arab intellectuals and really Western intellectuals and Western really literature in general and criticism. His first book called Intention and Method, really that book was a very influential book. In fact, his first book was his PhD was on Joseph Conrad. Conrad, the writer, the man who wrote the novel Heart of Darkness. Conrad was talking about the position of, again, the racial question of the Western colonialism and so on in Africa and in the all, if you like, of the Orient. And Edward Said in 1978 published his great book called Orientalism. Orientalism, which is, it was translated to so many languages, and in Arabic, many people translated it as Al-Istishraq. And Orientalism, in that book, Edward Said really laid the foundations of what I'm saying, as I said, for really the question of, real scholarship about how we people in the Orient, in the East, how we were portrayed and looked at by Western, scholarship, how novelists, poets, and writers, and even critics, and not just politicians. Edward Said was talking he was talking more about writers and novelists and poets and dramatists, how they looked at the East, the way they looked at us in a very crazy, really racial way. Did I lose connection, boys and girls? Did I? No, I'm fine, I think. Huh?
Yeah, you are fine.
Yeah. Okay, so this book here is, as I said, one of the main books that he wrote. Again, there was another great book by Edward Said called The World, the Text, and the Critic. The World, the Text, and the Critic is again a hugely influential book. In fact, to be honest with you, I was myself, really, to be honest, I was terribly influenced by his scholarship and the way he writes and the way he talks. He was the first man to talk about the question of the Orient and the self and the other. The question of the other and the self. He himself, alongside some other Indian professors like Gayatri Spivak and other people after him, really, who talked about this in such a great way. Edward Said was talking more about the Arab-Palestinian question, more. But of course, he mentioned a lot about the Orient in general, because I think all of us should read his book, Orientalism. Absolutely. All of us, readers and literature people, I don't know, maybe for you, students of education, I think also you should read this book one day called Orientalism in English. It's absolutely influential and lovely book. This book here called Out of Place is similar. Edward Said is talking about his real life. This is autobiography. This is autobiography. It's not criticism. It's not a novel. It's not literature, if you like, in terms of imagination. Edward Said is exactly recording his own real life. And as you can see here from this chapter, I gave you this section here. The way he talks about his name, even when his name Edward and Said, his name Edward is very Western name. Of course we know why, because he's originally Christian, and Christians everywhere, really everywhere, they think of themselves as Westerners. I don't know why, but this is really, I have seen this myself in my own real life in Syria. I have so many Christian friends who always think like this. You know, they think that they belong to the West. I don't know how, but this is the idea. Let me just, excuse me for a second, please. Okay, sorry for interruption. I have to check my main dish. Still cooking on the stove there, so yeah, I have to take care of it. Okay, so the idea really I wanted to say here is his name, because he gave us the first section here about how and what and why he was called Edward and Said. This, of course, his surname is Said, of course. He couldn't choose that, but his name, because he said, I was always worried about, and people, you know, asked him why and how can you be, you know, be like that or being called Edward. And he said, my mother really liked Prince Edward, the British prince, and she liked him. You know, mothers are funny sometimes. And, you know, she said, I named you after Prince Edward. Yeah, fine, fair enough. And he said, notice, the travails of bearing such a name were compounded by an equally unsettling quandary when it came to language. Remember, this is Edward Said writing in English, and English for him really later on became absolutely like native language. It's not, as you can see from his writing, you could never think that he's an Arab writing this in English. He is absolutely first class. In fact, I have seen many professors in Britain. They told me, you know, he is better than anybody. His language, the way he speaks, the way he writes is unbelievable. So when you read sometimes his books, you say, wow, is this written by an Arab? By an Arab? Yes. But of course, as I said, he was educated most of the time in English schools, and this is his language. So it's not translated. This is his original in English. I've never known what language I spoke first. You know, this is the idea. Arabic or English, or which one was really mine beyond any doubt. You know, and I think this is true, because sometimes people, if you speak, I know people who speak English all the time at home to their kids, and which is really lovely, and it's really very nice. And by this way, you can give your kids really some kind of flavor that they would be achieving or acquiring the language. Yeah? Yeah. Anybody asking? Yeah? Somebody writing something? No. Okay.
No,
okay. No problem. So notice here, he tells us, as I said, please read all this section, because really it's nice and it's very good. Now here he's talking in general about his name. It's very interesting the way he uses the word, you know, the Arabic stuff again in his own way. Like, for example, the way he says his mother said Tislamli, and he said it Tislamli, you know, as we say this in Arabic, in Syrian Arabic, or in, I don't know, do you say that? Do you use the word Tislamli here? I don't know. I think we say it. I mean, I think also you can say it, or you say it here in.
Yes, we say it sometimes.
قول تسلم.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very, very sort of could be colloquial, but I think it's used everywhere by Arabs. So he is writing sometimes words like that. You can see this, and he goes on to talk about that. But look at the next section here. He said, "Now not only could I not absorb, much less master, all the meanderings and interruptions of these details as they broke up a simple dynastic sequence, but I could not grasp why she was not a straight English mummy." You know, here he's talking about his mother, the way he speaks about that. And, you know, again, later on, he says here, notice, "I could not grasp why she was not a straight English mummy. I have restrained this unsettled sense of many, many identities, mostly in conflict with each other, all of my life, together with an acute memory of the despairing feeling that I wish we could have been all Arab, or all European and American, or all Orthodox Christian, or all Muslim, or all Egyptian, and so on." And I think this is true. You know, really this is true. Because these deviations is to him saying, "I don't like that." I found I had two alternatives with which to counter what in effect was the process of challenge, recognition, and exposure, questions and remarks that, "What are you?" You know, that's why here the question we say out of place, because he always felt that he's out of place. Because after leaving Jerusalem, after leaving his own country, he always felt that this place where he is, it's not his place. So that's why he was always made to feel that he's out of place. And I think this is very sad and very tragic in many ways. And that's what he means here. What are you? But Said is an Arab name. You are American. You are American without an American name. And you have been to America. You don't look American. How come you were born in Jerusalem and you live here? You are an Arab after all. But what kind are you? A Protestant? Blah, 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 blah. So he's all, you know, asking all these questions again to talk about his identity, you know. And I think this whole book, autobiography, it's again, you know, going back to Booker Washington, again, the same thing, you know, trying to identify really his own real self, his own real, if you like, character and personality. And he said that, notice, "I am an American citizen," and that's it. He was American by dint of having lived in the United States, followed by service in the army during World War I. You know, talking here about his father, you know, here he wants to tell us about his own background, because his father, again, is a Lebanese, originally Lebanese, emigrating, originally, sorry, not Lebanese, I'm sorry. The idea really to say again in the same thing, being immigrant to the United States. He was an American by dint of having lived in the United States, followed by service in the army during the First World War or World War I, partly because this alternative meant his making of me something incredible. I found it the least convincing to say I am an American citizen in an English school in wartime Cairo, dominated by British troops and with what seemed to me a totally homogeneous Egyptian populace, was a foolhardy venture. Look at this foolhardy venture. To be risked in public only when I was challenged officially. To name my citizenship in private, I could not maintain it for long. So quickly did the affirmation wither away under existential scrutiny. And, you know, he goes on and on about that. And he talks here about his father. Notice here, his father was called Wadi'. As you can see, my father Wadi'. Again, you know, he was later called himself William, you know, because to say Wadi' in English would be very difficult, you know. And again, you know, he said he was born in Jerusalem, and you know, he goes back to his own birth and background. Really, he said that. Notice again, he tells us about his background. He hated Jerusalem, and although I was born and we spent long periods of time there, the only thing he ever said about it was that it reminded him of death. You know, which is really sad, you know, really sad. When you are born, when you were, for example, when you were forced to have this background is sometimes really difficult. He talks here about his grandfather. He going back to his grandfather called Abu As'ad. As you can see, Abu As'ad, and again his name Ibrahim. In school, therefore, my father was known as Wadi' Ibrahim. I still do not know where Saeed came from. You know, here again he tells us how he became later as Saeed, because his name Edward Said. And the way he writes his name, again, you can see it. He writes it like the word said in English. And some people in England, they say Edward said, you know, because they are really deliberately saying it. They don't want to say Saeed because his name is Saeed in Arabic. And just to annoy him, to just say Edward said, you know, because he wrote it Saeed, the way to write Saeed in English could be difficult. Anyway, so the idea here, he tells us more and more of examples, as I said. Again, notice here in this section, notice, none of this was ever presented to me in sequence, as if his pre-American years were discarded by my father as irrelevant. Anyway, I really don't want to go on reading all this. You can read that yourselves. I told you to read it, to look at it, and I think it's only just one section. Let me check. I did not highlight much of that. Maybe the last section here really is the conclusion. As you can see, the last part. Notice here, he said, and thus I became Edward, a creation of my parents, whose daily travels, a quite different but quite dominant inner self, was able to observe, though most of the time was powerless to help Edward, was principally the son. When the brother was finally the boy who went to school, and you know, he goes on. Really, ladies and gentlemen, notice here the last section here, notice, he said, I think I will read this last sentence here. Notice, I think it's a lovely sentence, but again, it's really a long sentence. Notice, his creation, yeah, it's funny, it's really a long sentence. And I think Edward Said wrote this in his really difficult style, deliberately difficult style, maybe to prove himself that he can write difficult English. Notice, his creation was made necessary by the fact that his parents were themselves self-creations. Two Palestinians with dramatically different backgrounds and temperaments living in colonial Cairo as members of a Christian minority within a large pond of minorities, with only each other for support, without any precedence for what they were doing except an old combination of of pre-war Palestinian habit. Look at how many semicolons he said. This is a very long sentence. American lore picked up at random in books and magazines, and from my father's decade in the United States. My mother did not even visit the United States until 1948. The missionaries' influence, incompleted and hence eccentric schooling, British colonial attitudes that represented both the lords and the general run of mankind they ruled. And finally, the style of life my parents perceived around them in Egypt, and while they tried to adapt to their special circumstances. Look at this sentence, amazing long sentence. Could Edward's position ever be anything but out of place? Look at this question. And I think I love this quotation of this paragraph. Could Edward's position ever be anything but out of place? Yeah. So he's asking, how can I describe myself? And he's saying, yeah, this is really me. I'm always looking at all this background. So therefore I am definitely, my position is always, in a sense, is out of place. As you can see here, I said this is taken from Out of Place by Edward Said, copyright 1999 by Edward Said. Please read all that because it's lovely. Again, the idea, the main question here is racism, because Edward Said had suffered a lot from the idea of racial discrimination in America all the time. All of his criticism, all of his really scholarship that he wrote in America, and all his, as I said, when reading Orientalism and reading other books like The Question of Palestine and the question of, again, the book called The World, the Text, and the Critic. All of that was, all of this in a way to do with the question of racial discrimination, racial segregation, racism, the racial state where he was living, the racial state where he was living, America, New York, America. And really, that's it. When you read all that, you can never feel this, the feeling and the question that he was trying to always say, look, we want to establish our own selves, and we were never allowed in a way to feel at home. For him, he said it, I have never felt at home. And really, that's the tragedy about it. Okay, now really, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Really, I don't want to give you more than that, because I think it's quite really interesting to see all this. Okay, so yeah, if you really want any question, please ask, because next time I will give you, maybe if you need more analysis of this, I will do that if you want, but I think it's very clear. That's enough. Yeah, any question?